Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Almost everyone is familiar with these lyrics. Born in 1725, John Newton was a captain of slave ships who later became an abolitionist. He went to sea at a young age and worked on slave ships in the slave trade for several years. In 1745, he himself became a slave of Princess Paye, a woman of the Sherbro people. He was rescued, returned to sea, and the trade, becoming captain of several slave ships. After retiring from active seafaring, he continued to invest in the slave trade. After experiencing a conversion to Christianity, Newton renounced his trade and became a prominent supporter of abolitionism. He was ordained as an Anglican cleric and served as parish priest at Olney, Buckinghamshire, for 2 decades. Newton lived to see the British Empire's abolition of the African slave trade in 1807, just months before his death. Most poignantly, he wrote the redeeming song Amazing Grace in response to his life story. Chab Dai, the organization founded by today's guest, states the following: "The modern slavery crisis is an international and growing phenomenon impacting more than 40 million men, women, and children across the globe, 71% female and 29% male. Among these, more than 15 million are in forced marriages, more than 24 million in forced labor situations, and around 30% of those exploited are children. Human trafficking is the second largest illegal trade in the world, generating more than $33 billion per annum. This illegal trade has flourished as a result of increased demand for cheap goods and services and the collaboration of criminal networks that operate globally. No longer can we blame others for being perpetrators. We are all part of the problem, rarely looking at the slavery links to our purchases of electronics, garments, and food. Yet in the midst of these terrifying statistics, as an organization, we must focus on the ones. Every child, woman, man must be seen in the context of their own lives, their family challenges, their local communities, their lived experience of their abuse and exploitation, and their path of healing and journey for justice." Newton's third verse reads as follows: "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." Today's guest founded an organization with collaboration as a fundamental pillar of functioning. Changing this verse to the plural reads, "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home." Slavery isn't something individuals simply lift themselves out of. The responsibility is yours. The responsibility is mine. Chab Dai employs collaborative and empowering approaches where everyone is a learner and everyone is a teacher. Where things are not done for, but rather with. Where the example of hope transforms not only individuals, but communities and governments. Where faith-inspired love knows no boundaries in protecting the vulnerable. Join us as we discover a present-day abolitionist movement through a person and organization built on the vision of seeing a world where communities live in dignity, harmony, and freedom. On today's episode of the 6-8 Culture podcast. Welcome to the 6-8 Culture Podcast, an international community where we share stories of transformation and restoration from the inside out, based on justice, kindness, and humility. Come journey with us. I'm your host, Rob McKinley. Today's guest is the founder and executive director of the Cambodian organization Chab Dai. Chab Dai's mission? Seeking to end all forms of abuse and modern slavery globally by building a movement to empower communities, to strengthen systems, and to restore justice and well-being with survivors. It's both a noble and uphill task, fraught with many obstacles. Human trafficking is complex, fueled by issues like social inequality, culture and history, gender inequality, poverty, and economic disempowerment. With so many obstacles, the response must be a collaborative one. Chab Dai literally means joining hands, translated from the Khmer language. The Huffington Post writes, Chab Dai is one of the stars in emancipating girls and women from sexual trafficking in Cambodia, a leading organization in the field since 2005. They focus on eradicating human trafficking and exploitation through coalition building, advocacy, and research, and with a sterling reputation for doing exactly what they promise. Our guest has been featured numerous times for her expertise in combating trafficking in mediums such as The Economist, The Huffington Post, Cambodia Daily, Phnom Penh Post, numerous television and radio shows, as well as from peer experts and collaborative NGOs in the field. As the founder and director of Chab Dai, she's held this role for the past 15 years, developing and leading the organization's vision, mission, strategy, and objectives, directing fundraising efforts, and leading the international office and global learning community. Prior to founding Chab Dai, she held a number of management positions in corporate businesses before attending seminary and moving to Cambodia in 1999. She holds a Master of International Leadership, Innovation and Change from York St. John University, UK. Helen Sworn, a pleasure to welcome you to the 6-8 Culture Podcast.
Thanks so much, Rob. It's great to be here with you.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you on here. I know it's been a bit of a challenge for us to make our schedules syncopate, so it's really wonderful having you here today. As I alluded to in the introduction, Helen, you're the founder and executive director of Chab Dai. I had the pleasure of visiting your office in Cambodia a number of years ago and was simply overcome by the excellent work that Chab Dai does. We'll hear a lot more about Chab Dai in a little bit, but I'd love to hear more about you. Who is Helen Sworn? Where did you grow up? And what catalysts brought you towards the woman that you are now?
Wow, who is Helen Sworn? Let's have a think about that. I grew up here in the UK, working class family background. I am the youngest of 5 children. My father started off in law enforcement, actually in Malaysia and Palestine, and then back in the UK. Ended up as the most non-political politician I've ever met.
Wow, that's some feat.
Absolutely. Himself from a very poor background. And I always kind of considered my father as a socialist, but he was actually a conservative politician, juxtaposed in many aspects of his life. My mother says that I got my networking skills from my father and my workaholism.
That's really an interesting mix. How did that play out as an influence on you with this polarized political stances that he has as a conservative in some areas and socialist in other areas?
Very interesting as well, because my father was an atheist until just a few years before he died. And my mother was a Christian. She became a Christian after my elder sister died. So also had those dynamics of my mum being a very dedicated spiritual woman and my father being an atheist. So yeah, it was always very interesting growing up and being the youngest of a very loud family. My siblings and I are louder than life. My siblings will say, though, now that I seem to be the only one who lives to work and they work to live. So a very kind of Northern English family background. And then we ended up moving further and further south with my father's job. So a very diverse upbringing with all, I guess, the opposite extremes in the house. I didn't really feel strongly political one way or the other, even as I sort of came into my teenage years. I saw the good, the bad, and the ugly of politics, and also how the agendas around politics had played out in my father's life and the stress for him. I always knew one thing I didn't want to do was be a politician. I was clear about that. I ended up going into corporate sector, working for some local businesses, I felt quite driven, I think, to make my way in the world through the business. So I projected my way up into management by my mid-20s. It was interesting. By then as well, I got married. We were those very typical yuppie 80s, but it was very interesting. A point in our lives, really both challenged about what was our faith. I had come to faith in my childhood, gone away in my teenage years and early 20s, and kind of came back with a bang, I think, in my later 20s, of really questioning much of what I saw around me and what I was doing, how comfortable Christianity was here in the UK. And I can remember after being away from God for a while, coming back and saying, you know what, if I'm going to be a Christian, it's got to be all or nothing. I'm done with the Sunday morning Christianity. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, when you pray those kind of things, God takes you up on it.
The scary and exhilarating.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think within a year, I had given up a very successful career. And we're on our way to Bible college, pregnant with our first child.
Wow.
So that was where the everyday life got turned on its head and the call into the all or nothing began. So that was it was during our 3 years at Bible college. We did a double mission study. And in our last year, we had to do a placement. So we really thought that we were going to end up doing a business as mission in Vietnam. So had planned to go to Vietnam, and the mission agency said, yeah, well, we need to check you out first of all before we let you into Vietnam. So you can come to Cambodia. We're like, okay, we'll go to Cambodia.
Just curious, Helen, why was Vietnam the country of choice initially for you?
Interesting. God had just really put Vietnam on my heart, especially. My husband, he's like, I'll go anywhere. I'm like, no, I won't go anywhere. I need to know that this is where God wants me to go. I'm not going to just go anywhere. And our daughter was 2 years old at the time. And so we said, okay, let's head over to Cambodia and then go to Vietnam afterwards. So that's what we did. We spent a few weeks in Cambodia, had a pretty awful time. It was just before the coup d'etat happened in 1997. It was very tense. We had to travel in blacked out cars in the evening. Yeah, it was pretty tense. And then our daughter contracted German measles there. Frankly, as I was leaving Cambodia, I was goodbye, Cambodia.
Yeah. It is a shock. The first time I was in Cambodia, definitely a culture shock. But back in that time, I could only imagine how shocking that would be for this couple from England coming with a newborn to there in that environment.
Absolutely. I remember it was the first night we had arrived, and my husband, he was told that he was going to go do English teaching as a second language. Off he goes in a blacked out taxi. My daughter and I are on our own in this guest house. And as the person left the guest house, they said, if you hear gunfire, just get under the bed.
Yeah.
It'll be fine. Yeah. Bye. See you in the morning. I'm like, okay. And guess what happened about an hour later? We hear gunfire. And I grew up in England. We don't hear gunfire. So it was probably like a half a mile away, but it sounded like it was right outside the door. So then it's like, okay, how many games can I play lying under the bed with my 2-year-old daughter saying, we're going to just stay under here? Reading books under the bed. So that was an interesting experience.
So then you left to Vietnam after that?
Left to Vietnam. We had a good trip into Vietnam, and we had thought that we were going to set up a business school and then have a fee paying and then use those fees to give scholarships to the poor, basically. Right. And then we went into Thailand just for a retreat for a week or so afterwards to really sense what God was saying. And I was sat in a prayer meeting one evening, and I'm arguing with God, which I frequently do, and saying, okay, God, where is this? Where are you taking me? And I kind of was having this stirring of Cambodia. And already my husband had said, I think it's Cambodia. And I'm like, no. And I remember sitting in that prayer meeting going, okay, God, well, here's the thing. If you want me to take my 2-year-old daughter to Cambodia, I want this in triplicate. You got to make this so clear that I'm never going to have a shadow of a doubt that this is where you want me. And a voice behind me said, this is the way, and walk in it. Turned around and there was nobody there.
Wow.
And it's the only time I've had an audible voice from God. And that was the moment. I went back, looked up in Isaiah, the passage, I think it's Isaiah 30 or 33, that says, whether you turn to the left or to the right, you will hear a voice behind you saying, where that was my triplicate with God. So yeah, we came back to England. Within a month of being back in England, the coup d'etat happened. Everybody said, well, of course you're not going to Cambodia now. I'm like, oh yeah, we are. We got pregnant with our second child. And then when he was 6 months old, we headed out to Cambodia. So Hannah would have been 4 by then and Joel 6 months old.
Did you have any connection pieces at all in Cambodia at that time when you went back there to help settle you?
So we went out with WEC, which is a mission agency based out of the UK. And so there was a small team of 6 single Asians there who were doing a mix of church planting, orphanage, and street kid work. And so we went out to join them as the first Westerners and the first family. So I wasn't quite sure who was the most culture shocked, us or them.
And so backtracking a little bit, first of all, in Vietnam, where were you when you went to Vietnam and where were you planning on settling there?
So we were in Ho Chi Minh and we were planning on being basically tent making missionaries there in Ho Chi Minh.
Okay, so when you went back to Cambodia, initially with Vietnam, you had this vision of opening up a language school and helping advocate for the poor as a result of some of the fees that are coming in. Was it a similar dream that you had in Cambodia or something completely different?
It was interesting because we realized that Cambodia wasn't at that stage. When we went back, we moved there in January 1999, and Cambodia was still reeling, not only from the Khmer Rouge years, but reeling from the coup d'etat that had happened 18 months before. So actually, when we went back, my husband went to set up a vocational training school in IT and do English as a second language, really as an entry point for basically street kids, orphan kids, some of the really poor communities, to get a vocational skill to give them access into the workplace. For me, I was primarily getting involved in the Street Kids program that they had. So they had a mobile drop-in center that went out to some of the slum areas of the city. It would go out at like 5 in the morning and 5 in the evening. It had medical drop-in, it had a shower, it had a feeding center there, and then a place where basically kids could play. There were books and toys and stuff. So that was what I was originally involved in.
And this was right in Phnom Penh, I'm assuming?
Yeah, right in Phnom Penh, right down by the riverfront, which is where a lot of the slum areas were, which is now a casino, actually.
I know exactly where you're talking about. We're listening to Helen Sworn, the founder of the Cambodian abolitionist organization Chab Dai. Stay with us as we hear more of Helen's compelling story that led to the formation of the Chab Dai Coalition. Okay, so then you were there. You've decided to move there completely, settle down, have some roots there. Maybe this can bridge us into how Chab Dai came about, or if there's any transition pieces between that part of your life and when the inception of Chab Dai happened.
Yeah, well, the raft in the middle there was about 6 months, 7 months after we arrived in some of those slum areas that we were visiting. We were seeing that quite a lot of the kids had gone. So we started talking to the adults in the community to find out what had happened to the kids. They said, well, you know, a lot of families have gone up to the border area between Cambodia and Thailand. And this is where families can make money. And I said, oh, are they going up there for a short time? And they said, oh, well, you know, most of these kids we don't see again. So the team that I was on, we all were pretty shocked about that. And so we started asking the families more about where the children had gone. About 5 of us decided to embark on a research trip. And the roads back then were, well, you couldn't actually drive very far, partly because there were still large pockets of Khmer Rouge. There were still large pockets where there were landmines on a lot of the roads. And so we took this small plane, prop plane from Phnom Penh up to one of the towns in the north called Battambang, and where we were going to then get a car, an old Toyota Land Cruiser to get us to the border. Right. So we get in an old Russian prop plane where there's no door. It's just like, you can just see straight on in. There's like a few animals, a few chickens in there, and we get to it and we take off. and the whole plane fills with smoke.
Wow.
And I'm like, okay. So I turned to my colleague who was sat next to me. I'm like, so are you ready? Are you ready to kind of like go a bit earlier to heaven than we had anticipated? Wondering if this really was going to be the last time. But no, we flew all the way up to the town, and then we landed in a field on the other side. The farmer kind of moved all the cows out the way as we were coming in, and off we went.
Wow.
So we then ended up in one of these old Toyota Land Cruisers. And now the road journey now from Battambang to Phoi Phet would take maybe a couple of hours. It took us about 15, I think.
Wow.
With the breakdowns in the middle.
Yeah.
And the truck going into potholes that were as deep as the truck.
Oh my goodness.
And so I can remember when we were like maybe about halfway through this, saying to God, really? Like, why on earth am I on this trip?
Uh-huh.
For some reason, I volunteered. I'm not quite sure why I volunteered to be on this trip. Because I'm sure that I would have been just far better off not having nerve root compression on the base of my spine, but actually, staying in the city.
Right.
I had a sense that God was saying to me, this journey is going to determine the journey that I take you on for the rest of your life.
Huh.
And this journey is going to be really hard. And the process that you're going to go through in the coming years is going to leave its scars on you, just as this journey will. And so we got to the border town of Phoi Phet. And nothing really prepared me for what we saw. We saw children being traded through the border between Thailand and Cambodia. We saw young children taking other young children through the border and money traded through the border. And then on the other side, we saw children being deported back from Thailand in trucks, which I have to say still happens today, 22 years later. Some things change and some things don't. And then we were meeting with a number of organizations up there to really see how could we, as a small NGO, help address this new phenomenon that we thought of called human trafficking. We had no idea at that time that this was modern day slavery. We had no idea at this time in history there are more people in slavery than the entire transatlantic slave trade. I can remember the very first child I met. She was the same age as my daughter. She was 4 years old, and she was responsible for her baby brother, who was about the same age as my son, about 7 months old, 8 months old, and was carrying him around on her hip. And she was tiny. And so, I was learning Khmer language, and I can remember sitting with her and saying to her, where's your mum and your dad? And she said, I don't know. We went through to Thailand together. We were begging on the streets of Bangkok, and my mum and dad would go off working in the night and leave me and my brother. And then one night, me and my brother got picked up by the Thai police and thrown in the back of a truck. And then we got driven up to the Cambodia border, and we got deported through the Cambodia border. And we don't know where our mum and dad are. And they may be looking for us and we're looking for them. And that little girl had made this little woolen doll. And I was saying to this girl, I said, you're the same age as my daughter, and your little brother is the same age as my son. And I said, you know what? I'm going to do everything that I can to help you both, but not just to help you both, but to help other children like you. And she gave me this little pink woolen doll. And she said, I want you to give that to your daughter. I want your daughter to remember me. My daughter now is turning 27 years old. She works for a university in Singapore. And you know what? She still has that woolen doll. And she still works on issues around human rights and speaking up for people. So that was the beginning of, not the beginning of Chab Dai, the beginning of the journey that God was taking me on into this movement of modern slavery and human trafficking. It was 5 years later that I set up Chab Dai. So in the middle of that, I was working for a number of different organizations, doing research and working on programs, and then Chab Dai.
The There was a transitional process of learning and acclimating yourself to all the nuances of Cambodia and the different challenges that you were to be facing. So Chab Dai came about. And let me just start by saying that you and I share quite a few mutual friends, all of whom cannot say enough good things about you and the work of Chab Dai. So on that, Helen, we've heard the story that planted this seed in you. Apart from that, what drives you to do the work that you do? What's behind this passion that has made so many inroads in so many people's lives during the time Chab Dai has been in existence?
You know, in a similar vein to that journey, I was working with a lot of other people on this issue, and a colleague and I had a visit from somebody in the US State Department. A very long story cut short, they were funding a big project, and when we said, well, there's a lot of small projects that need funding as well. Lots of great small organizations who are trying to address this. And as a result, she threw out a challenge and she said, well, see if you can bring them together then. So I was like, oh. So this colleague friend of mine and I, he's actually on my board now, Glenn, we said, oh, okay. So we started connecting with those organizations that were addressing trafficking. And we realized that there were a lot of organizations who had come to Cambodia to address this issue, but very few of them had a context of Cambodia, and very few of them knew who else existed. And so the more we were digging, the more we saw a very siloed response. So we thought very naively, oh, well, we can just bring them together, right? Because everybody's going to want to work together on this. So let's just bring them all together. So it was probably about a year. It was more than a year before we actually got them around a table. Everybody was saying, well, you know, I'm busy and I don't know if I've got time to work with other people. And we were trying to say, well, actually, this is really critical for us to work together. And so eventually when we got people around the table, what we did was something very simple. And it's something that we still do to this day, and something that we say for anybody who's looking to set up a network or a coalition to do. And that is a very simple process, which is basically a mapping process. So we talked about what are the key issues that we're trying to address. And everybody loves talking about the problems. So we had, you know, this huge list of all these things that everybody wants to address. Okay, let's prioritize them. So in the olden days, we didn't do stuff online. We had this like big old map of Cambodia. And then we had what every NGO has is Post-it notes.
On that, did you find consensus in what the major issues were as you ordered? Good, okay.
Yeah, we did. We found a lot of consensus. And when you're building a network or a coalition, what you need to establish at the beginning is common ground. And so that is a great leveler, because it doesn't really matter how big your organization, how small your organization is, a great leveler. And a great way to get common ground. And so then we did this. We said, okay, who is doing what and where? Okay, you're this color if you're doing prevention. You're this color if you're doing rescue. You're this color if you're doing aftercare. You're this color if you're doing education, and, you know, and put it where you are on the map. These were all Christian organizations, but I've been working with some others as well. So I said, I'm going to put other organizations and government organizations and UN organizations that I know are doing work on there. And then let's just have a look at this map. It spoke for itself, right? It's like there were probably 8 to 10 aftercare shelters. There was not one doing prevention. There are a couple of doing intervention. And we said, okay, so therefore, let's have a look at the gaps and let's have a look at the overlaps. And that really was our first mapping that was the precursor to us setting up a pilot year of Chab Dai, of bringing organizations together to establish a national referral mechanism, a coordinated response, and to do some research. That was how it started. And the reason that all of this really came about is that Glenn and I both knew that this was what God was leading us into. Glenn abandoned me and went and did his PhD in the UK, but he came back with his wife, who then ended up working for me. So
excellent. Wow, just that process in itself is amazing. It's brilliant in its simplicity. It's incredible. And that's how Chab Dai was essentially birthed.
That was how Chab Dai was born. And then we got together, talked about names, talked about joining hands. And then, of course, we needed a Khmer name. And so joining hands. Chab Dai, which means joining hands in Khmer. So that was the beginning. I think we had 12 member organizations at the very beginning. Right now, we're at about 54 for the Chab Dai Coalition. But yeah, there was just myself and a volunteer in a borrowed office, and that was the beginnings. Now we're at about 50 staff. On the ground in Cambodia, we've got 47 Cambodian staff, 1 expatriate, and then myself and 1 other staff member here in the UK.
It's one thing to be passionate about causes such as present-day slavery and trafficking. It's altogether something else to implement a sustainable framework that transforms passion into transformed lives. Next, Helen walks us through the foundational pillars that Chab Dai works from. So let's continue to talk a bit about Chab Dai. There's just so much to this organization, and we can really only scratch the surface on this podcast about it. But I'd like for us to discover some of the unique qualities in the world of combating trafficking and slavery. So on your website, it says you have 5 core values: collaborative, empowering, learners, responsible, and faith-inspired. So can you expand on these core values pertaining to the work that Chab Dai does? You already have in many ways, but it would be great to hear how these core values translate into the actual work that you're doing on the ground, whether it's through story or just example of your process in how you carry the work out.
Well, some of these as well, I feel they're both aspirational and also form follows function as well. So collaborative. It's become a buzzword, right? We work collaboratively, we do this collaboratively, and sometimes there is a danger of this becoming just rhetoric. What does it look like in practice? And so for us, we know that we cannot do this on our own. Chab Dai cannot achieve its outcomes if we worked on our own. So when we're looking at our projects, this is how core collaboration is to us. I have a thing about circles. You ask my team. I do circles everywhere. So we have a circle, and in the middle is the goal of the project. And then we have these concentric circles, and we say, okay, let's write all of the partners, all of the stakeholders, government, UN, community, religious, NGOs, whoever they are. Let's write them all down on Post-its, of course. And then let's look at who are the most influential stakeholders in achieving this goal. And let's put those in the middle. And then we build up this picture, and we call it our strategic partnership assessment. And so it goes into the very design of our programs at the beginning. Who are we going to work with? Who are going to be our key partners in this project? So much so that when we design our monitoring and evaluation, one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, who else helped deliver this impact? It's a much more honest way. It's not just Chab Dai. Our work is reliant on us building social capital with stakeholders, right, which frankly, if we look at the last year and COVID, has been phenomenal. The social capital that we have built over the years, the government have come to us and said, how can we collaborate with you? How can we help you? You're not allowed to go to the communities right now, but we can. Tell us what we can do. Wow. The government are asking us how they can help us.
Fantastic.
So collaboration, absolutely at the heart. We would say this is like our DNA. Empowering. I think as we look at community development models as well as responses to human trafficking, there can be a danger of sweeping in with a savior mentality. That has happened a lot over the last 2 decades of this movement. It creates a hierarchy, it creates a dependency, and it creates a hero mentality of those who are doing this work. We want to take a step the other direction. We don't do this for the people that we're working with, we do it with. Right. Joining hands, Chab Dai. This is not us doing for communities, this is us doing with communities. When we look at the communities that we are working with, they have themselves stepped up as volunteers to develop an entire grassroots advocacy movement. And we call them community heroes. We say they are the heroes. They're school teachers, they're police officers, they're village leaders, they're pastors, they're Buddhist monks, they're Muslim imams. And they're the ones who I can remember somebody saying to me, I said, this is the model we're going to do. They said, Cambodians are never going to work for nothing. I said, well, they never will unless you try it, right? And so this empowerment model is that this is the community developing their own safety nets for their own communities. Learners. Well, this is a big lesson for all of us, but for me and for our team. We're in the middle of a conference this week that we helped to organize called the Asia Regional Anti-Trafficking Conference, which when we had to go online last year has really become a global conference. And it is critical for us to continue to be life learners, to continue that knowledge building and knowledge sharing as a movement. We need to remain curious, we need to remain humble, and we need to remain open. This is something that I learned so much today from some of the sessions that I was picking up on. Our team, it's been beautiful. They've all kind of like left their desks and they've had the screens up in the office and they've had their little mini conference within the conference. They're all watching it online. And then they're getting into groups and discussing it afterwards. And so we need to be learners. The environment changes all the time.
Right.
We do not change and we do not learn new things. We are using yesterday's models to develop responses for today's problems, right? And again, for all of us, the last 18 months of COVID have driven that home to us. If we're not open to being learners, how are we ever going to adapt to this unprecedented environment that we're in?
Yeah.
Responsible. Wow. It's interesting because some people will say they will elevate people who are working in this. And we say, wow, we actually bear a massive amount of responsibility. We are accountable to the survivors that we work with, the community members we work with, the government ministries we work with, our NGO partners that we work with, our donors. As a team, we are accountable to one another. And sometimes that actually can feel pretty weighty, this responsibility to fulfill our purpose and our mandate and our vision. So we take this role of responsibility very seriously. We try to be as transparent with the use of our resources as we possibly can be in following best practices and taking ownership for our growth as an organization, also where we fail as an organization. So we hold one another accountable and responsible for our actions and behaviors, especially in these core values, right? We want to commit to who we are and who we want to be within responsibility. And then last but not least, faith inspired. This is a controversial one, actually. I never step away from a bit of controversy. As you can hear from our conversation, I am a follower of Jesus. I am a Christian. And so I do not try and hide that as the motivation for doing the work that I do. But I also know that so many of our amazing partners that we work with do not hold the same faith as I hold. I know that many of our staff members do not hold the same faith as I hold. But together we are, each of us, proud of our faiths and beliefs, because this is a way that we bring our faith to bring change to our societies. And we believe in human rights and justice for all, and believe that is very much aligned with our faith, very much aligned with social justice theology, and we are inspired by that. We work on the basis for each of us, our faith inspires us to protect and care for as many people as we can, for us to be kind and open and loving and graceful and inclusive and really caretakers of those around us with that responsibility of our faith. So I come to the table as a Christian. Some of my staff come to the table as Buddhists. And so we all say, yeah, actually, our faith is incredibly important for us. What it also does, especially in Cambodia, in a nation where faith is a collective understanding in every community that we work in, right? It means that we don't have to shy away from faith. We can talk about faith We can talk with faith leaders about their responsibility to their faith communities. Now, whether that's a Christian pastor and we're talking about his responsibility within his church, or whether that is a Buddhist monk and his responsibility to the people in his community, or the Muslim imams and their responsibility on keeping their communities who are massively at risk of trafficking to the Middle East, for example. We also know that within Cambodia, Christianity is, I think, at about 2%. If we decide that we're only going to work with Christian pastors,
right, it's very limiting.
98% of the population.
Yeah.
The faith inspiration for us is a huge piece of not only our foundation, but actually the way that we want to respect the communities that we work with.
I just want to touch on something here, Helen, is movement building. People often will say, what happens to survivors of human trafficking? How do they integrate into society after going through such horrific, traumatic experiences? So NGOs and other sectors are committed to growing the anti-traffic movement through professional capacity and standards in order to provide the best possible care to survivors and vulnerable communities. So one thing that really stood out to me as I was going through your website was the butterfly reintegration research. So it's a 10-year project to better understand reintegration for male and female survivors of sex trafficking. It says the purpose of the Butterfly Research Project is to hear directly from the participating survivors about their lives, understanding, and experiences so their voices can contribute toward a greater understanding of the complexities of reintegration and NGO programs. So I think that in itself touches on all 5 of these core values. And could you share more on this, just expand on the study, its findings, any stories behind it?
Yes. Oh my gosh, where do I start? Yes, it's still one of the few longitudinal research projects in the world within the context of human trafficking. And I can remember at the beginning being really proud of that. And now I'm like, wow, everybody, we're putting in millions of dollars into addressing human trafficking and modern day slavery around the globe. And really, we're only going to be investing in snapshot research. Mm-hmm. A catalyst for this was there was a survivor who, after 5 years of being back in the community, committed suicide. It wasn't one of ours. It was a survivor in another program. And I can remember thinking, what happened? What happened? And it was mostly around the stigma, the communities finding out about her past and her not being able to get away from it. Yeah. So we had among our Chab Dai Coalition members a number of aftercare shelters. So I said, what we need to do is we need to more clearly understand what's happening after these survivors are leaving the shelters. Because if we don't understand it, again, we're building programs based on misinformation. We're building on policies based on misinformation. So again, it was a very ambitious project. A small grassroots NGO embarking on a longitudinal complex research project with 15 aftercare shelters and 128 survivors of sex trafficking. It's been a crazy journey. I mean, to date, we've published about 20 research papers on this. You can find it on our Chab Dai website. And we were really trying to understand some of the complexities of their lives. This wasn't about us going into their exploitation. We were very clear on having a strong ethical framework and ethics review every year. But we wanted to understand what happened as they went back into community, what happened around their justice, which frankly, their experience in the public justice system was probably one of the hardest things for them to talk about because it was so unsupportive of them. We talked about faith. Some of them were Buddhist, some of them were Christian. Actually, for some of them, 4 of them said actually having faith prevented them from committing suicide. So faith actually came in very deeply there. There was a lot of financial challenges that they had to deal with, many of them living with debt. Most of them ended up in relationships where there was domestic violence. For some of them, their lives got harder the longer they were back in community, which was the complete opposite to what we thought was going to happen. We thought their lives were going to become easier. There were many, many things. I mean, we can talk about stigma. There's stigma for them when they went back into the community. Some of them, frankly, their experiences within Christian aftercare shelters were not always very positive. So this has actually been influential around the world now for us to understand really what was happening, not just female, but male sex trafficking survivors as well.
Do you also have any stories of triumph that you're at liberty to share with us, whether that be individual renewal or legal regulatory improvements, anything along the lines of the work that you're doing? Stories of transformation, success, improvement on the lives of these people you're helping to emancipate from these lives of slavery?
Yeah, I mean, we've got some amazing stories. I think what comes through for me over and over again is the phenomenal resilience of people who have gone through unthinkable exploitation and abuse. It was interesting. There was one case that we had, and she was a child rape victim. And the public justice system is not kind to basically any victims of crime, frankly. And this was a child who had to face her perpetrator in court. And she just showed the most remarkable bravery. She ended up getting cross-questioned by defense lawyers. This child stood her own ground. She was 8 years old. And she stood her own ground in court and ended up, even though it was a really horrendous case for her to go through, we saw some justice at the end. It was just remarkable for everything that she had gone through. And still, a lot of the cases, we fight for compensation for them. But sometimes, even when we fight for compensation and it's awarded, it's not always given. You think of these families and what they've gone through in giving their evidence in court. And she said, even though it was really hard, it was the right thing for me to do. And I'm glad that I did it. And I am stronger for it. And I will grow and I will become stronger and stronger. And she had this just amazing resilience within her that enabled her to say, I am going to move through this and I am going to be a strong person who's going to make a difference. Yeah, we've just had so many cases. That's an example, but we've had so many cases over and over again where our clients have had to face just horrendous trials and they have persevered through it. We've had amazing family members. I think that it's easy to say, the families are all corrupt. But actually, we've seen families who have just rallied around, who have supported the people within their families who are going through court cases. And those families are often contacted and found by the defendant's lawyers. So, they may get offered bribes to withdraw their cases. Sometimes they're threatened with violence to withdraw cases. But the families have remained strong and committed to taking the case to court, even when they've been pressured in the community. So yeah, I think that we see from this just amazing resilience. And this is why we say within our programs that this is not us doing for, but doing with.
That's fantastic. And I've seen similar challenges in many other countries other than Cambodia as well, where this model that Chab Dai is utilizing would just be of such great benefit. As you're touching on this, it's reminding me of the empowerment core value that you're stating, empowering communities. So another aspect of this is strengthening systems. And I know that's something that Chab Dai does. How does this work in strengthening systems within the Chab Dai context?
Well, you know what? The rationale behind this is that we are only going to see long-term sustainable change in a nation if we work with and through the government entities. So for us, we have advocacy project. And so the stance that we have decided to adopt is what we call soft advocacy. We respect organizations that do what we call hard advocacy, where you demonstrate, you're shaming governments for what they've done. And there is absolutely a place for that. For us, we have decided from the beginning that we would adopt a soft advocacy approach, which means it takes a lot longer. We build relationships with government, through government. and we support those within government that we see willing to stand up for issues, and we align ourselves with them, because what we want to have is we want to have good people in the government who are going to stand up. And there are some amazing people within the Cambodian government who are beginning to move the needle in helping the nation really implement these frameworks and increase political will to effectively and efficiently respond to these cases and see some justice happen. So the system strengthening piece is key. You know, we see that we kind of work at the three levels. At the macro level with the government, helping support strengthening of the systems, at a kind of a meso level with lots of partners who are NGOs and other stakeholders, and then at the micro level, at a very personal level with survivors and communities. So we see them as three parallels that we need to work on.
That's great. Very, very helpful in understanding how that works. Helen, you've been at this for many years now. You've led the Chab Dai organization through many different challenges. It continues to be very successful in what it does. Now, if we can talk just for a brief moment about leadership succession, it's a critical consideration for NGOs. Are you able to share your experience in this? Any touch points, such as localization for sustainability and cultural context for leadership succession? Please open this up to share some wisdom on this.
Okay, excuse me as I just climb on my soapbox. And I think that one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves as foreigners going into another nation is, who is holding the power? Because I am a white, Western, middle-class, educated woman. When I walk into a room in Cambodia, I know where the power lies, and I hold the power, and I hold too much power as I walk into that room with that profile. And it can be a very dangerous thing. It can mean that actually you have very little accountability, because very few people are going to call you out. Very few truth tellers are going to come alongside you. When I first set up Chab Dai, I can remember I'd been reading the 7 Habits, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits. And one of the things that struck me was begin with the end in mind. And I can remember thinking, what is my end in mind? My end in mind is that this organization will be a national organization. It will be ran by a Cambodian who is going to be the change that they want to see in their country. And if I can help be a catalyst for this, this is what I want to be. And it was so interesting when I interviewed Yang, who was our national director for 14 years. I sat in the interview with him, and within 5 minutes, I'm like, yeah, this is the guy. So I said to him, one of my last questions was, I said, so this organization within 5 years will be localized to national leadership. How do you feel about that as the incoming national coordinator? His face just kind of looked at me, and I had somebody else interviewing with me, and they looked at me like, what are you talking about? 5 years down the track, you're going to hand over to the national leadership. Poor bloke is just in for his interview. And he looked at me and he said, that is amazing, and I want to be a part of it.
Wow.
So that 5 years, on our 5th birthday, we had a celebration and a handover of the organization's stamp and ownership to Yang. Now, there was a journey towards that. The journey was, we had to build the house of Chab Dai. You know, for me, the foundations were the trust and respect, but we had to build our systems and our policies and our processes, financial structures, and all of these kind of things. We had to build a robust organization that could take itself into a national role. I hired an external consultant who would keep me accountable, because I'm the founder, right? You know, anybody who's read anything around leadership knows about founders syndrome, right?
Yep.
And sometimes it's really hard for founders to take the hands off things. So we had somebody from outside come in and spend time processing this with the team, with the leaders, and with myself. And it was very interesting because there had been a couple of leadership successions in Cambodia, and one of them had gone very badly wrong, where the Cambodian director changed the locks, took over the bank account, wasn't good at all. But it was a few years beforehand. The funny thing is that I had so many expatriates say to me, this is really risky. What you're doing is really risky. And I said, this is fascinating that you're all saying this to me. I said, first of all, this isn't even our country. We're visitors here. Secondly, this isn't mine. This is God's. Yeah. Like, I don't own this. I don't own Chab Dai. I'm just caretaking it because this is what he asked me to do. So you know what? If it all goes belly up, then I've got some lessons to learn, but actually it isn't mine.
Yeah.
So I really believe that as expatriates, we hold often too much power. And some of the arguments that expatriates would give to me in saying, what about the power thing? And I'm like, can we just take a look at ourselves, as expatriates?
Yeah.
Tell me, are we willing to give up the power? Because I think this is often much more about us. So it was a really interesting experience. I handed over to Yang as the national leader. He became the legal owner. I started working on our global learning community, as well as still supporting him and doing a lot of the fundraising piece. And Cambodians would come up to me and they would say, thank you for believing in us. Thank you for believing that Cambodians can run organizations in Cambodia. Thank you for speaking out and saying that actually you are only a visitor here and we're grateful for you, but you're not Cambodian. This will never be your nation. And they're absolutely right. It will never be my nation. It's my heartland. Cambodia is embedded in my heart, but I am not Cambodian. I ended up actually doing a master's thesis on this. For any nerds out there who'd like to read it, you're welcome to. Just drop me a line. I think that we need to ask ourselves these questions when we are going into work in another nation. Are we perpetuating a whole new colonization? And, I'm British, and that was not pretty. Colonization around the world, that was not pretty. There were some awful things that happened, and I am ashamed of what my nation and my ethnic group have done. I think that this is hard questions that we need to ask ourselves as expatriate leaders who are working around the world.
That's fantastic. There is just so much wisdom in that and what you say pertaining to leadership succession. And I'll have Helen's contact information near the end of this podcast if you'd like to reach out to her and get some wisdom from her writings and her experience in this area. Helen, there may be some people listening right now that want to contribute their time or resources and come alongside Chab Dai. Are there volunteer opportunities with Chab Dai, and what ways can they help support this organization?
We do take volunteers. We're pretty strict on all of our, police checks and processes and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, obviously we are not taking any volunteers into Cambodia at this time, but we actually have a volunteer working for us right now who's phenomenal, who's got some great technical expertise, is quite young and has got some great ideas. And this is a great opportunity for him as well as he looks to shape his own career and how that fits. So yes, we do. We would love to have people who are willing to volunteer time. Now, that could be somebody who comes along and says, you know what, I'm a web designer. I'm happy to give you a week of my time, or I'm happy to give you a day a week of my time, or however much time, 6 hours a week, or I'm taking 3 months off and what can I do? So people kind of have a stereotype of what volunteering looks like, and it has to be in Cambodia and it has to be for 3 months or whatever. It's like, no, actually, we're all working from home, right? So let's do stuff from home. So yes, we are open to volunteer opportunities. And there is a piece on our website. We've got an email. I think it's volunteer@chabdai.org.
Excellent.
So yeah, get in touch.
Thanks so much, Helen. What are some of the biggest hurdles that Chab Dai is currently facing, and how can people best support this organization in overcoming it?
We are in unprecedented times. We've just been looking at our first half year statistics, and we've got double the amount of cases of trafficking and exploitation than we had planned. Along with that, we have got staff who are having to isolate. We've got pregnant staff who can't go out to the field right now. We have got staff who have been unwell. We are currently feeling under-resourced and overwhelmed. The staff are working their socks off to deal with the amount of cases that there are. The other staff that we have, still many of them are working from home because there's parts of Cambodia that are still in lockdown. So a lot of the staff are only able to dedicate less hours than normal because they're homeschooling children. And I've got family members who have lost their jobs. Lots of jobs have gone. So they are finding the pinch themselves, our own staff. We've been doing food packs for our own staff as well as for communities, because pretty much every staff members, their families are impacted in some way, shape or form financially because of COVID. So we're going to need to look at taking on more staff. And so we have to raise funds, which we call, these are our core mission. Staffing, we call our core mission and our core expenses. And it's really interesting because a lot of people are like, yeah, I'll fund a flight. I'll fund for some counselling sessions, or I'll fund for some food packs, but I don't really want to pay staff salaries. And so I think that we have to just see this in a holistic way and
Absolutely.
see that actually these staff are the support.
Yeah.
They are the lifeline to the survivors and the communities that we are working with. And so without them, we are not going to be able to help as many survivors as we need to. I was talking to somebody in another part of the world a couple of weeks ago. We've been talking to lots of different people and cases are doubling. And so, right now we've got a global number of about 40 million people enslaved today. Next year, maybe that's 60 million. This problem is getting bigger.
Yeah.
If you just look at some of the World Bank statistics on child labor and poverty that's gone back like 20, 30 years in terms of its numbers, increasing up to 500 million in the last 18 months back into poverty. This is not an issue of 2 years. This is something that we're going to need long-term changes and support. The other thing is, frankly, we need people to pray for our staff, for them to stay safe, for our community members to stay safe during this time of COVID. Everything is so uncertain. Everybody is living with so much fear that we really need to pray and just seek within our own faith structures a bigger solution to this. Please hold up our teams as well as those that we're working with.
Thank you so much for that, Helen. It really puts things into perspective for many people, especially living in the West, when we're talking about millions of people living in such conditions in slavery. Many of them are children. And to find out more about how you can better support Chab Dai, you can visit their website at chabdai.org, which is CHABDAI. Helen, do you have any final words that you'd like to share before we wrap up here?
Yeah, one thing that I would just say as we wrap up is that the statistics are huge. And I feel like sometimes people can be paralyzed by those kind of numbers. But I'm going to say something negative and something positive. Something negative is actually we are all a part of this problem.
Right.
And it's easy for people to say, well, I don't buy sex, so I'm not a part of the problem. And I think that we need to ask ourselves those questions of what clothes are we wearing? What coffee are we drinking? What components we got in our mobile phones and in our laptops. This makes us all a part of the problem in the global supply chain, which is underpinning modern day slavery. But we are also all a part of the solution, whether that's volunteering, whether that's praying, whether that's giving of money, whether that is writing to your member of parliament for laws to be changed, whether that is lobbying people for better working conditions for migrant workers in your country, whether that is addressing your supermarket that you go to and writing to them and asking them about their supply chains. There's a lot of things that we can do within our own backyards that can make a difference to this issue.
Very well said. Words that I always strive to live by is check your chain. And if we can examine our own purchasing decisions throughout our lives, that makes a huge impact when we look at that from everybody utilizing those same practices and choices. Helen, thank you so much for joining us. We covered a lot of ground here. It's been a very enlightening experience for me, and I'm sure for many of our listeners. We just really commend you on the work that Chab Dai has been doing and the work that you've been doing through this organization. Again, if anyone wants to connect or contact with the Chab Dai organization, the website is chabdai.org. That's CHABDAI.org. Helen Sworn, thank you again for joining us on today's episode of the 6/8 Culture podcast.
Great to be with you, Rob. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for sharing your time with the 6-8 Culture podcast, where we share stories of personal transformation that are making our world a more just, kind, and humble place. Join us for our next session of impacting stories with 6-8 Culture. This is Rob McKinley signing out with a reminder for us all to act justly, to be kind, and to walk humbly.